Hello, my name is Silvester Henderson, and I am the CEO of Professor for Life Incorporated. I am so grateful this afternoon to be able to interview the wonderful academic and scholar, Dr. Fredrick Dixon from the Radford, Virginia area. Welcome, Dr. Dixon.
Thank you so much.
I'm wondering if you can introduce yourself to our digital media academic world. Tell our audience about, your journey and your education and all those wonderful things.
Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate you allowing for me to join your platform and have this dialogue with you about the importance of, you've mentioned it before, folks being able to have an opinion and have it where it's documented, where it becomes part of the narrative, if you will. But today I'm hoping that, like many other days, that we can have a clear pathway to the light of understanding under the searchlight of truth. So I appreciate you allowing for me to be here. So again, my name is Fredrick Douglass. I'm only Dixon on payday, right? So to understand that, Dixon is a Scottish name, and that is a ultimate reminder of the over 400 years of how those who put that name upon families after families, generations after generations, who were absolutely not Scottish, who were here before the Scottish folks were invented, were crafted. So it's always important to have that conversation and to make sure that that's concretized. I'm second generation historian, educator, and a liberator. So since my earliest infancy, I've learned been trained how to appear in spaces like formal education and other spaces, but thinking about what I do for a living, to go into these spaces and explain and be a witness to what it is that challenges the dominant discourse and the authoritarian narrative in a way that's empirically accurate. And also it's that we leave this example for the youngest generation so that they can have, if you will, a counter narrative to all the things that takes them and overwhelms them about Western supremacy, Eurocentric culture. So we came and we continue to show up as an intervention. We come to do in many ways what some would say is circumcision. Like we want to be able to cut away those parts that have held us in bondage from our own understanding of who we are to bring about a new thought. So in that regard, again, I owe a great deal to my father, the Honorable Professor Willie Dixon Jr. from Chicago. And I'm here today to make sure that we can have a conversation that I'm sure will be based or centered on non-normative standards.
Wow. So you know what, if I may I call you then Dr. Douglas?
Well, let's just say this. You can call me Brother Fredrick.
Okay, I'll do that.
That's what I really want to be. I want to be a good brother.
Okay, then I'll
to understand. Let's separate this. Yes, sir. Yeah. Let's just separate the idea of what formal education does. Right? So to understand that, to look at how many folks that are now part of that 1% that have Ph.D s, that means to deconstruct it in a way that permits for further conversations. I think about just what the difference is between a doctor and a PhD. Now, I want to separate them and put them at odds.
Okay.
So I think about a PhD, right? And I'll do this in inverted order, and then I'll come back to it. That means that you've already secured a credentialing that leaves you in the top of the top, if you will, of those who have been able to persist in formal education. And then we take a step back and think about those who've earned master's degrees. Now let's make this make sense to the Black population, the masses of the Black population. So from that, we look right there at a master's degree, and then let's take a step down and look at a bachelor's degree. And many folks that we know who have PhDs have started in a position where they have secured associate degrees. So during that time, and even before that, in our K through 12 experience, what are we really taught? So we know that the traditions and the training from Western culture will leave us in positions that looks to an iconic whiteness. So in many ways, when we're not prepared to have spaces to have conversations like what you're doing, that leaves us able to walk away with this, with new questions, new ideas, and spaces where we can discuss them, then I think about the person with the AA, the person with the BA, the person with the MA, and the person with the PhD, which means that PhD means all that they learned before that is piled higher and deeper. And then I look at someone who's a doctor. And again, I separate those on purpose to say that we have brilliant Black sociologists that have been educated at the highest and in the best spaces that Western education can train. And we know that they have brilliance. And then you think about how their brilliance and all that they have written very well, written in maybe even challenging ways to white supremacy. And then you think about all that happens in higher ed, and you look at sociology and the study of society, and then you look at if those paradigms, if those ideas, if those readings, if those tasks that you have to complete to get a PhD, what does it do for the Black community? Because when you think about it, a Black sociologist with a PhD, brilliant. And then you look at the plight of the Black society. To understand the plight of the Black society is to challenge the fact that what Western culture can do in a way that brings about a person of thinking, a person of knowledge of themselves. And then you think about a doctor. You think about brilliant Black psychologists, and then you look at the condition of the Black psyche. We have brilliant Black educators who have PhDs. And then we look at the condition of education in the Black community. And even when we think about those of us who are from the theological lens, we have brilliant Black theologians. And then we look at the condition of the Black church. So in many ways, we have to challenge it and say there's a difference between going to school and earning a PhD. Because when we say that you have become a doctor, then that puts on the table that you have the proclivity, the likelihood, the training that will be able to heal the Black community. That will be able to move it forward to a point where when we begin to think about questions that need to be answered, and you think about a Black psychologist and you look at if their work can at all, through this Western culture's lens, have anything to do with crafting new life and new thought among our youngest generation? I say it does not. I say it does not. So you're thinking about the Black sociologists in the Black society. Look at the plight of the Black society. So to earn a PhD is much different. That means you persisted through so many programs. But to say that you're a doctor in the Black community would tie relevance to your ability to go into that community and use all of your training to heal the evolutionary trajectory of the Black community. And I say this as we begin, I just don't believe, and I'm saying this in a very tacit way, that there's Western culture and its education is not set up in a way that a Black PhD can be effective in healing these problems for us to be a united people with the light of understanding. So I want to get that straight first. There's a big difference between being a PhD and a doctor.
You know what? You've made some real interesting assessments. What you're saying in a nutshell is just that when a person take on the title of doctor, they need to actually have a commitment to make change, and they
need to be prepared to make change.
To be prepared
in many
ways,
in many ways, Doc, like it's not what it is. Many ways, you know, I think about Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1933. He said there was a miseducation of the Negro. If you think about chapter 1, I think chapter 1 is called The Seat of, what does he call it? The Seat of Trouble. And in that first sentence, in that first paragraph of the first chapter, he says, the formerly educated Negro has an attitude of contempt And what he means by that, they've been taught to praise, and he goes on to say, the Teuton. So to understand what we're taught and to expect a Black Ph.D. to become a doctor, that doesn't mean it can't happen. We're talking about the masses. So I absolutely believe the miseducation of the Negro. And by 1967, E. Franklin Frazier produced a work that was called The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And to understand the crisis of the Negro intellectual in 1967, that was 57 years ago. So we have to be able to move it forward today, right? To move it forward today. And not only is there a crisis amongst the Negro intellectual, I'll say today there's a failure in the Negro intellectual, particularly the Black PhD.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you tell us specifically, however, what institutions you obtained your degrees from? And then can you kind of describe your work as a full-time director of African American Studies at Radford University in Radford, Virginia?
Okay, well, the way I look at it is I have an assignment. Many folks have jobs, many folks have tasks, many folks have duties. I have an assignment. I'm second generation, which means I understand what I was trained to do.
Okay.
So having conversations with you like this is one of the most important parts that connects the classroom to the community and brings about spaces where we can have discourse and then action. So to look at it that way, the center part of my work as Director of African American Studies at Radford University is closely tied to its newly acquired African American Studies positionality. So in 2023 was their first attempt to inject African American Studies into the lexicon of the university, which means they're really late in the game, right? If we think about how many years have gone past since 1969 at San Francisco State. And before I go any further, I do want to say that I am here as one of the many students of the great and the honorable Dr. Nathan Hare, and may he rest in peace and may God be pleased with his work. Yes, I think for any of us who will ever see this, you owe yourself a duty of gratitude, particularly if you work in Black studies, African American study, Africology, and things of that nature, to read what Dr. Hare said this particular industry would be after it was formalized. I think he got it right without question, and it's a blueprint about what to do. Now, African American Studies at Radford University, which is a state institution, it is in itself not only is it new, it represents this idea of new thought, which is for many folks who have for years had this institution, who worked at this institution, have not had a challenge to having conversations or having curriculum that is defined intentionally as African American or Black. That it just has not been the case. So we arrive and it becomes where you see how traditional these arguments are, if we should be able to have African American studies. Now, in a simple but yet important customer service model, if students are calling for it, then they should be able to, because they're paying, they should be able to study it in a way that allows for them to feel as if they're part of the dominant discourse. Well, to think about Radford University, we are in a precipice, or we're standing at a space right now where in the first year we went from 3 to 28 majors. So, we're very busy about doing those things that are important to institutionally to concretizing ourselves. But we're really just introducing to the masses of people, more specifically to some of these folks who are, provosts, presidents, and professors and deans that have never really heard anything very intentionally about African American studies, but they have an idea of what they want from it. So it's this new space where we continue to, every day, we are bringing about a new reality. We're bringing about new conversations. We're bringing about a new representation that asks students, and that is in itself a power, to ask students to become socially responsible. And to say after year one that I think we were successful, I do. But I also believe that the institution in itself has different pockets that over the years, we're asking them to change what they think about African American studies. And if they don't have a clear understanding of what it is, it can become very complex and convoluted. So now we look at it like it's African American studies, but what is it? What does it do? How do we go about on a daily basis changing their attitude, actions, and behaviors in class? Well, one of the things that I'm tied to is introducing students to the rigor, the baseline, the rigor of graduate studies. Because if you think about a degree in African American studies, absolutely you can go out and get a job. But in several of those instances, you're going to need to go and find a graduate degree for you to think at things in a higher level. So we want to prepare them through their classroom experience about understanding the rhetoric. How do you have the experiences about how you internalize and how you respond in a written fashion? So it's very detailed about how we want to train students to be prepared to be successful in a global society. So to look at Radford University, there is this potential. And that potential in itself has already begun. But again, I'll be honest when we say we have absolutely had some pushback just because of our presence.
Now, let me ask you a question.
Ask me any question you want, Doc.
Okay. Man, tell me, are you saying now presently, is your directorship, is it assigned to a particular department? Like, is it assigned to the Department of African American Studies, the Department of History?
We have
an African American historian.
Well, I'm a historian, period. In fact, I want to be clear again, I'm a second generation historian.
Okay.
Right. So that's clear. Like, I think we were discussing a little earlier, like to understand the origin and then the development, they can be separated as two different phases.
Okay.
Like those who trained me, particularly my father, I have a different understanding of what that origin is. I was introduced to that. And this, as we move forward, is the development. That's why at these institutions, we are moving from the impetus to something that is more institutionalized. So to think about Radford is in a very good space. But, think about our social atmosphere right now. It'll be very easy to say that African American studies should be continuously tied with sociology. And I want to make sure I answer that question. That's where we originated from. A group of sociologists took the task of introducing African American studies to the institution as a call, answering a call from a group of students. Wow. So it being at Radford is the essence of Black studies. If we understand its origin, again, 1969 San Francisco State, and students calling for it all across the country by that time. So it had a feeling that was very representative of the origin of Black studies. And when I decided to take the job after I was offered the job, I actually ran it past Dr. Nathan Hare. And at that time, he was already in a long-term care facility. And he explained to me, he said, that's the essence of what you want to do. So I was always interested, but I had more than one of my elders explain to me, and they didn't all agree, right? They didn't all agree. They thought the work that we had done at Wyoming and being able to get things off the ground and have it be institutionalized in such a way would be a good place to stay. But right now, Radford is the space to continue this work. It's another, if you will, level of the development of what I came to do.
Who influenced you to become an academic professor and really a program director? Was it just your pop? Was it your father in general, or? Oh
yes, brother. It was my father. Period. Like I'm the last child. So
okay.
and being very clear, the most wayward is the best way to say it. But the one that was most close like him, but I couldn't tell that as a young person. So my earliest memories are going with him as he taught classes at different higher education institutions in the city of Chicago. And for about 30 years, he was the lead historian at the Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable Museum, which was at the time the largest African American history museum in the country. So those are my origins. So I remember at a very early age meeting Paul Robeson. I remember at a very early age meeting John Hope Franklin, being in these spaces. And then as I got older, it became something that I rebelled against, that I didn't want to be a part of. And then as God would have it, move me closer to being able to use those things that I saw for generations I had never met that I'm introduced to now. So there is a group of being a second generation educator that I was always introduced to. And now these folks who are now our elders have had a huge influence on me in formal academic spaces. So some of the jobs I was able to get as a very young professor had everything to do with who I knew, which we understand that's nepotism, but it was a different kind of training. So some of the folks that I would mention to you are like Anderson Thompson and Jake Carruthers. This is the Center for Inner City Studies out of the city of Chicago, which is this hub of African American and Black studies. And it trained me very well. But those folks were pretty hard on me. You know, I had an expectation. So they used that old school kind of training, not all, but they had an idea of what I would be able to do to help. So now when I think about that training and I look at it and I look at our students, I have to be able to extract the best out of it and leave the rest out of it and apply it to their thinking and what they want to do and how successful they can be. So sitting in that position, I can kind of understand it because in some ways they weren't trained the way we were. And you have to be able to make it a reality and make it so that they can take these tangibles. They can be able to deconstruct what society will expect of them, and then for them themselves to find themselves to be socially responsible. And that's, somebody would say, or not just somebody, I've heard the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan say on many occasions that that's like going to wake up to dry bones. You know, when we think about all that our students are up against with social media, with some things that are very attractive now that are absolutely part of modernity, they have to have other examples that are outside of, again, this normative thought. So I think about it, and no place I would rather be than to be in the middle of helping move forward this generation, particularly when you know that there's something that will be waiting for them that they have to be prepared for. And what I mean by prepared for, they need to be able to deconstruct it and be able to analyze it in a way that when it's time for them to pick up the mantle and move forward, they'll have enough experiences and they'll have enough understanding to be able to take those things that you thought were important and make them applicable to how they want the future to look. So we're always in the middle of helping and being in those spaces where every day we are having these conversations with those folks, and we know that they have questions and we know they have answers. And, you do your best to make sure that you allow for them to speak freely. And then there's an accountability that comes from knowing. And once they know, we hope that from that, they become more serious about what life looks like for them in the future.
Now, do you have an opportunity as a director to teach actual classes, or you create curriculum and you create different programs for the students or what have you? Do you actually teach courses or teach a class along with your directorship?
Oh, yes, sir. So I teach intro courses, which are always the seminal fluid of any kind of academic entity. Because, you get a lot of folks that you may never get back in the intro class, but they're there and they want to be there. So that's the place to begin to introduce and invite and have this connection with students where they move along to become part of the program more defined. Yes, I teach intro classes. I teach a Black freedom movement course, 1955 to the present. And one of the things that's very important for me in this program is to teach independent study courses.
Okay.
So we have a wide range of topics that come from our independent study courses. But that's really the concretization that all comes out of the intro course. So the intro course, again, pointing back to it, is the seminal space where now we get folks from psych, we get them from social, we get them from the hard sciences, and we introduce them to, in many ways in the state of Virginia, students don't have anything defined clearly in K through 12. So it's the first time for many students to have had something they've chosen as African American studies or Black studies or an independent study that allows for them to dig deeper into subject matter, to be introduced to some of those folks who are in their paradigms who are parked or frozen at the fences of academia. So it's very important. But yes, I teach multiple classes, and we are always in spaces where we look to find ways to have students work individually, and that's normally through independent studies.
Now, can you describe some of your research and how some of your findings have improved learning for not just your students of color, but all of your students?
Oh, absolutely. So a central part of my research is contemporary social movements, particularly the Black student movement of the late 1960s and the 70s. And that is part and parcel, or one way to look at how social movements, contemporary social movements are still, you can find those strategies and techniques today. And not just like Black Lives Matter, although you see them in Black Lives Matter, but how some of our students believe that it's not okay for them to be a part of something that looks as if the best part of it or its strategies and techniques didn't get enough done or didn't do enough in the past. So when we think about the way students march, those are all very revolutionary tactics and strategies, and we can point back to the civil rights movement. And many folks don't have an understanding about the civil rights movement and how radical it was, particularly through the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So teaching Dr. Martin Luther King in an intro class, or a Black Freedom Movement 1955 to the present, or an independent studies class, or through our programming. So last year at the university, at Radford University, we had a book club, and that book club in itself examined the book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? That's Dr. King's book, 1967. So the idea in that was to teach Dr. King in an inverted order. So we started with his last book first. So by the time our inverted order get us back to 1963 and the March on Washington, he's a different Dr. King. So we're having different conversations. We're looking at it through, again, non-normative lens. But if you read Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, the largest chapter in that book is chapter number 2, and that book is called Black Power. Many folks don't even believe that Dr. King dealt with Black Power. Not in a way where he wrote about it, not in a way where he discussed it. So with our students, we always want them to have a critical lens, and we want them to challenge the mainstream narrative. And in some ways, that becomes where we begin to inject some of these great readers, some of these great scholars. Some are still living. So to think about the passing of Dr. Nathan Hare is one way to look at it. And then to look at one of his brightest students, Dr. Raymond Wimbush, who wrote a book in 2012, Should America Pay? About reparations. So, we read these writers, we bring them into the classroom, we bring them into our programming, and from that, we build this intergenerational continuity. And that's what's very important, for them to have spaces where they can question, they can respond, and in many ways, they can take away from it what they believe versus what other folks have come out to prove to them. And it creates a space that a lot of times leaves students, when they've had these, not necessarily an epiphany, but a space to have this really serious critical self-reflection. And we want all of those things to happen, particularly when we think about a classroom setting leading to a programmatic setting that leads to them being renewed in their own self-upliftment. So, as you know, it's very complex. But the one thing is, when students are willing to spend time with you in a classroom, through programmatic efforts, through becoming a part of being socially responsible, it's all a blessing. And in many ways, there are a couple of laws that guard the universe. And one of those laws is the laws of use. What you don't use correctly, you lose. And then you think about the laws of abuse. What you abuse, you lose. And then you think about this, nothing lasts forever. All three of those laws are very important when we think about us being those who forward information to our students. So I'm always very aware of those laws of nature.
You know, you make some very, very significant statements and that really make our audience think. I want to ask you just a couple of more questions, brother Fredrick. Well, can you kind of share, what do you feel, if so, is kind of like one of your most significant research accomplishments? Is it a textbook that you've written, or an article that you've written, a program you developed, or what have you?
I think I've developed programs which were very helpful to the community. I think there are many spaces where I've sat at the feet of very erudite men and women where I've taken a lot from it and been able to use it to forward to other people. But let's think about something contemporary today. Just last year, I completed an article with a professor out of Buffalo State. He's the head of Africana Studies, Dr. Marcus Du Bois Watson, who's named after Marcus Garvey and Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. And he's the head, again, of Africana Studies at Buffalo State. And our article was centered on a evaluation, a review, a critique of Black Studies at 55, which was this year. And we used Dr. Nathan Hare and his approach and his response to Black Studies becoming part of the ivory tower. And we called it New Nuanced Negro Studies. And we gave it a very severe critique, but it's needed. And now that Dr. Hare is no longer with us, I'm very proud of that piece because it came as a way to not just honor him, but to reintroduce him to the youngest population that is now Africana Studies, Africology, and in a lot of these spaces that you can have a 16-week class and an introduction to Black Studies and not mention Dr. Hare. So it's a call or wake up to some of these people, and some of them are old enough to know Dr. Hare, and some of them have been his students, and some of them have, been for years, which is sad to say, at odds with each other, because you know how academics and any other part of life can be when we're at odds with each other. You think about Dr. Hare starting or creating the Black Scholar, and then you think about the twists and turns with Robert Christman, and then later Dr. Sundiata Chachua. Like, to reintroduce Dr. Hare was one of my greatest, not necessarily an accomplishment, but a contribution. Okay. And that contribution had to be laid out in a way last year. And now, a year later, he's no longer with us. And he got a chance to read the manuscript. He understood what we were doing. And now it is, as you say, it's documentation about what he said, about what Black Studies would be, what it would become. And he was absolutely accurate in his assessment. So to bring that back up, I have presented that piece at the National Council for Black Studies and some other spaces, but for historians, particularly Black historians, to continue to remind us of how we find our great scholars written out of history and then we do it ourselves. That is indeed problematic. So I wanted to make sure we left a piece that would be representative of being or going to a space that would absolutely show and prove that this is how we distinguish what we know to be a needed conversation.
Wow.
And it's injected in such a timely fashion that I would say there's no way that I could have thought about doing this a day earlier than I did, and a day to the date of his death. So he was able to see the manuscript before it was published. And now, it's in the Urbana Journal of Africana Studies. And if you don't mind, I'd like to say that we're about to create a special edition that I'm going to co-edit with folks who want to send their thoughts in ways that are academic about the legacy of Dr. Nathan Hare. So we're looking forward to that as well.
Wow. Can you share, I just got one or two more questions for you.
Yes, sir.
Can you kind of share with our audience, what sort of challenges have you faced as an African-American professional working within the system of higher education?
Latent racism, this idea of being marginalized as an academic. And I have to go back to say I was prepared for it all, but I want to lay them out. So when I think about being very dedicated to teaching students how and what is important for them to be successful in graduate school as freshmen in college, well, that's a duty. And then I wonder how Ph.D.s and those who consider themselves doctors can influence students academically, but don't teach them what they've been taught. So I think it's very telling. Also, I think one of the challenges is that there is this, going back to that 1967 book that E. Franklin Frazier wrote, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. I think it's, in my life, particularly in my career, I think we're at an all-time high of being tied to higher ed as a way to separate us from the Black community. Because one of the things that Dr. Nathan Hare talks about from the very beginning of Black Studies in 1969, he said, as soon as the community activist piece was removed from Black Studies, that was the signaling of the end of it being a community piece. And I think it's absolutely right. I think, and not all, but I think there's a critical mass of Black professionals who find themselves doing great work writing and researching and even teaching courses, but in many ways they don't connect it to the community. Because that's one portion that can be very challenging to a ruling regime. If you can explain to students how their job or how their assignment should be tied to the community. And I think that Dr. Hare made it plain. I think that many folks that have come after him have made it plain. But I think there's a critical mass of Black PhDs and Black master's degrees and Black EDDs who really use this cloak or this shield of higher education to connect them to material culture, which is really outside of the duty of the Black historian, particularly the Black professor. So I'm very critical about those paradigms that continue to leave us in spaces where we don't even have the conversation. So there is absolutely a need now to have more spaces with the youngest population about social responsibility and what that looks like to somebody who's a freshman in college and even younger.
Wow. You have enthralled me in so many different responses. Can you give us or share any of your final thoughts, some of your future projects, some of your future innovations and goals that you have not only for Radford University, but just you as a man of impact to help improve life for students of color and students in general within the system?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I'm now which I've always been tied to, but now more than ever is building independent Black institutions outside of higher education, outside of K through 12. And it takes those brilliant minds who understand, and Russell Rickford wrote about it years ago, the need for, and he gave us this documentation of independent Black institutions. And that means that we have to be able to create our own spaces that are outside of Western dominance. So Saturday schools are very important, and I'm very tied to them. I also believe that in the future, if higher ed remains stagnant, it will have to be a part of a huge makeover that would in itself provide an opportunity for independent Black institutions to be prepared to step in and answer the call and create these spaces where we would understand more clearly that we have to fund our own institutions. We have to, through the creation of our own institutions, we have to sustain our own institutions. And we have to have those of us who believe that they're important. And I think when that starts, and I think that there will come a time where, I mean, even thinking about the upcoming election, what will happen with the Black community politically after this upcoming election? Like, we don't have enough conversations about that, particularly about those who are in higher ed with so-called positions of authority. And a critical critique about this, and I'll use this as a way to move towards the conclusion, is when I think about our brilliant, the critical mass of our brilliant folks who work in higher ed, those who have, if you will, a modicum of authority, then that's something in some ways, and in many ways, is almost like managing white affairs. So, you know, when we think about, I think Dr. Gay was her name at Harvard, to understand how brilliant she is, and to understand all that she had gone to get to that point. How do we get those folks who sit in those positions to fight for, without becoming problematic, for future generations, for those folks they'll never meet? It'll be very difficult without an intervention. And that intervention has to be very practical in a way where the community can help build out these thoughts about what they need. Because when you think about the standpoint theory, it's a feminist theory that says all knowledge is socially situated. And by it being socially situated, I think about Dr. Gay and all the drama that it caused the Black community. One way to look at that is Black women at that point, and still are now, are attaining higher ed degrees at such a high rate that they've taken over the top tier. But what does that do in many ways for the Black community if there's a critical mass of our Black women who are the most prepared, who are still in institutions that are not independent from the Western society? So we have to make these spaces. That's why your work is so important, brother. And I think I said enough tonight, but I just want to say thank you for you allowing for me to have this time. And if there's something that I can do to help you, please don't hesitate. And we can see how we can get you out to Radford, maybe.
You know, one day I would love to visit Radford.
It's a beautiful space.
I am so honored, man, to have had a chance to listen to your thoughts and your perspectives and your brilliance. Having had this podcast for some time now, it's given me a great ability to hear so many varying perspectives and ideas and thoughts. But, you know, rarely do I find a person who has such a deep passion for real change. And I was thinking to myself, I listened very carefully because I want to listen to what is the core of the person that I have an opportunity to host. And you to me have really demonstrated a heart of real change for not only people of color, but for humanity. And for that, I want to congratulate you and thank you. Education is full of many people who are really into titles, but very few people are really into impact, growth, and development. But you know what? You are a man who has shared a great amount of knowledge. And as the CEO of Professors for Life Incorporated, I want to thank you for taking the time to come and let me speak with you. God bless you. And I look forward to developing a relationship with you even more so, and staying close to you. And brother, you take care of yourself and God bless you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.